All right, so we're taking a deep dive into those Palo Alto City Council minutes you sent over.
Oh, should be interesting.
Yeah, January 8th and 16th, right?
That's right.
It's like peeking behind the curtain of local government.
Exactly. And you know what they say? All the world's a stage.
Huh,
Tch.
too true. And even those meetings that seem kind of procedural, like electing a new mayor.
Oh, absolutely. Those can be the most telling. You see the power dynamics, the alliances, the different visions for the city's future.
It's all there. And speaking of electing a mayor, that January 8th meeting had a bit of a twist. So, quick reminder for our listeners, in Palo Alto, the mayor and vice mayor aren't directly elected by the whole city, right?
Right. It's the council members themselves who vote amongst each other.
Exactly. So there's already that layer of, internal council dynamics at play.
Which, let's be honest, makes it way more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So most council members, they voted for Ed Lowing, who was the vice mayor at the time, to step into the mayoral role. Pretty standard stuff.
Yeah, seemed like the expected outcome.
Right. But then, council member Greg Tanaka, he throws a bit of a curveball.
Oh, what do you do?
He nominated Vicky Vinker, another council member, for both mayor and vice mayor.
Wow, okay. He came in swinging.
Right. So it got people talking. Was this Tanaka making a big statement trying to position Vinker as like a future mayoral contender?
Interesting. Or was it more of a strategic move, maybe signaling some dissatisfaction with how things were shaking out on the council?
Exactly. Now, Vinker ended up declining the mayoral nomination. She threw her support behind Lowing. But still, Tanaka definitely set a particular tone for the rest of the meeting.
I bet. So what else caught your eye in those minutes?
Well, before we jump into the public comment period, which was a whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, very lively. There was this one detail from outgoing Mayor Lydia Ku's farewell speech that I thought was interesting.
Let me guess. It involved a certain photo op with President Biden.
You know it.
Huh?
So she mentions how President Biden, made a point of including her in a photo.
Which on the surface seems like your typical I met an important person story that politicians love.
Right, exactly. But something about the way Ku brought it up, it felt like it meant something more to her.
It's like she sees her legacy as mayor extending beyond just Palo Alto. She's building relationships on a national level, advocating for the city's interests.
Yeah. It's a subtle detail, but it reveals a lot about how she views her role. And that leads us right into the public comment part of that meeting.
Oh, this is where it gets good, right?
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really interesting.
Always my favorite part.
So, normally these city council meetings, you get residents weighing in on things like development projects, maybe noise complaints.
The usual suspect.
Exactly, like hyperlocal stuff, right?
Right.
But these two meetings we're looking at, January 8th and 16th, they drew a lot of attention, and for some kind of unexpected reasons.
Really? Like what?
Well, the first topic that really dominated the public comment period was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Wow. Okay. Didn't see that one coming.
Right. Like you wouldn't necessarily expect that to be front and center at a Palo Alto City Council meeting.
You're telling me. So what did people say?
Well, it seemed like the minutes mentioned it was pretty evenly split. You had residents urging the council to pass some kind of resolution calling for a ceasefire.
Interesting.
And then, on the other hand, you had people who felt really strongly that the council should just focus on Palo Alto issues.
Yeah. Stick to their lane, right? Which I get.
Right. And it's interesting because on one hand, you have these local elected officials, right? And they're the ones who are supposed to be the most accessible to their constituents.
Right. The most accountable, too.
Exactly. So reflecting what their constituents care about, even if it's on like a global level, that's part of the job.
Sure. But then there's that question of like, what can a city council really do about a complex international conflict? They don't have any direct power in like foreign policy, right?
Right. Exactly. So it's a tough one.
Definitely a tough one. So what was the other big topic? You said there were two.
Oh, right. Yeah. So the second one that kept coming up, and it's something we're hearing more and more about these days, especially from younger generations, climate anxiety.
Yeah. Makes sense.
They mentioned several students who spoke at these meetings, and they were really urging the council to make climate action a top priority. I mean, one student even cited a study from like the journal Nature.
Wow, they came prepared.
Right, like they're not just showing up with anxieties, they're coming with data, they're coming informed.
They're ready for action.
Exact.
And it makes you realize that for a lot of people, this isn't just about, like, environmental policy, right? This is about the future.
Absolutely. It's a much deeper concern.
It's a whole generation that's dealing with the potential consequences of climate change. It's a lot of pressure.
It is. And it really makes the council's job even harder. Like, how do you create a sense of hope? How do you empower those young people?
Big questions for sure.
It's like these city council meetings, they're kind of like a microcosm of all these bigger conversations happening, right?
Totally. It's fascinating how those local level decisions, they often reflect these global trends and anxieties.
Exactly. And speaking of microcosms, let's talk about something that, well, it sparked a surprising amount of debate at that January 16th meeting: trees.
Trees. Really, what's so controversial about trees?
Right. You wouldn't think so,
Yeah.
especially in a place like Palo Alto.
Known for its canopy and all.
Exactly. But it turns out, even there, managing trees, it can get kind of complicated.
Because everyone's got an opinion about trees, right?
It's true. And at this meeting, the heart of the matter was this proposed changes to the city's tree protection ordinance.
Oh, right. I read about that. Wasn't that ordinance adopted back in 2022?
You got it. It was seen as a pretty big win for like environmental groups and people who really want to protect Palo Alto's urban forest.
Which, given climate change and everything, it makes sense to, be proactive.
Exactly. But as with any new policy, there's always that period of like, okay, let's see how this actually plays out in practice.
Work out the kinks.
Exactly. So a year in, the council was doing its due diligence, reviewing the ordinance, seeing what was working, what wasn't.
And what did they find?
Well, it became pretty clear that not everyone was thrilled with how things were shaking out.
Makes sense. So what were the sticking points?
It really came down to this tension between, like, the big picture benefits of having lots of trees.
Right, things like air quality, shade, even just like the aesthetic of a tree-lined street.
Exactly, all those things we love about trees. But then you have to balance that with individual homeowners' concerns.
Like what?
Well, property rights came up a lot. Like, how much control should the city have over what a homeowner can or can't do with trees on their own property?
Yeah, I can see that being tricky.
And then there's the safety aspect. One resident actually spoke about how a tree that the city had told them was healthy ended up falling on their property during a storm.
Oh, wow. See, that's what I'd be worried about.
Right. So it's like, how do you balance those individual concerns with these broader environmental goals? It's tough.
No easy answers for sure. So did anything come out of all this debate?
Well, Councilmember Lithcott Hames, she threw out this really interesting idea.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
She proposed this tree replacement program.
Okay. How would that work?
So basically, the idea is if a resident needs to remove a tree, let's say for safety reasons, or maybe they want to build an ADU, something that requires a permit,
Right.
they'd then be required to plant 2 more trees elsewhere in the city to kind of make up for that loss.
Interesting. So it's like a mitigation strategy.
Exactly. It's acknowledging that sometimes trees do need to come down, but it's also trying to ensure that the city's overall tree canopy doesn't decrease.
It's a start, I guess. So was there anything else from that January 16th meeting that stood out to you?
Oh, there was one more thing, and it involves a certain electric car company you might have heard of.
Let me guess. Tesla.
Bingo! Remember how we were talking about those public-private partnerships and how the details can get kind of interesting?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, this is a perfect example. So the city and Tesla, they struck this deal to upgrade a local electrical substation.
Which on the surface sounds like a win-win, right? Tesla gets the power they need for their new headquarters. The city gets an improved electrical grid.
Exactly. But Councilmember Koo, she raised some really important questions during the meeting.
Like what?
Well, it turns out the substation, it sits on land that's actually owned by Stanford.
Oh, wow. Didn't realize that.
Yeah, and at the time, the city was still in the middle of negotiating their lease agreement with Stanford for that land.
So it just added this extra layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Exactly. And it really highlights how even when you have these agreements that seem pretty straightforward, there are often these underlying factors that can really complicate things.
Totally. So as we wrap up our deep dive here, what are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind about local government?
Well, I think the biggest one is that local politics, it's anything but boring.
Oh, for sure. There's always something going on.
Always. whether it's debating trees or trying to figure out how to deal with global conflicts at a local level or navigating these complex deals with big companies.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think it also shows that even in a place like Silicon Valley, where everyone's always focused on the next big thing, those more traditional concerns like the environment, community engagement, those things still really matter to people.
Absolutely. You can't just ignore the human element.
Exactly. And I think for anyone listening who's maybe felt like, oh, local politics, that's not really my thing,
Think again.
right. Give it a shot. Attend a meeting. See what it's all about. You might be surprised by what you learn, and you might even find yourself wanting to get more involved.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, we'll be sure to include links to the full City Council meeting minutes in the show notes if anyone wants to dive deeper into any of these topics. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.